Hello, everyone. Thank you for attending the IPECA Raw Materials for the Energy Transition webinar series. My name is Christy Lowe, the Nature Manager of IPECA. In this webinar, we will focus on embedding circular economy across renewable supply chains. Before we begin, we wanted to cover a few housekeeping items. At the bottom of your screen are multiple application tools that you can use. All the tools are resizable and movable, so feel free to move them around to get the most out of your desktop space. You can expand your slide area or maximize it to full screen by clicking the arrows on the top right corner. If you have any questions during the webcast, you can submit them through the Q&A widget. We will try to answer these during the webcast. Note that we do capture all the questions, so we may be able to get back to you after the end of the webinar. For the best viewing experience, we recommend closing any programs or browser sessions running in the background to help conserve your bandwidth. The webinar is recorded, and an on-demand version of the webcast will be available approximately 1 day after the webcast and can be accessed using the same audience link that was sent to you earlier. We'd like to remind you that this is the second webinar of the IPECA Raw Materials for the Energy Transition series. So if you would like to rewatch webinar 1, which was live yesterday, or participate in webinar 3, which is on the 28th of February, please register yourself using the link on the resource box on the right of your screen. Today, we are very delighted that we have 4 speakers with us from 4 different organizations. So we have Barney Hill from ICMM, Rachel Asante from IUCN, Libby Sandbrook from Fauna and Flora, and Maria Orban from Shell. So without further ado, I would like to pass the time to Barney to share with us ICMM's journey on circular economy.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Christy. And it's great to be part of this really important webinar series. So I'm from ICMM. Some of you might know us. We are an industry association for the mining industry, focusing entirely on finding opportunities for collaborative improvement on sustainability performance in the mining sector. And today I'm going to be talking to you about our work on circular economy. And so to take you through the journey that we've been on with circular economy, when we started looking at this in real detail around 3 years ago, we spoke to a huge range of different people within the mining industry, within our value chains, in governments, and in circular economy think tanks. And we very often came across an image of the circular economy, which looks something like this. So you have a single circle, usually with some variation of reduce, reuse, recycle. And there's always this small tail on the side, which is the input of raw materials. And the goal of the circular economy is often seen as reducing that input of raw materials by keeping things in the system. However, at the same time, as you will all be aware, we're facing this massive increase in demand for critical minerals for use in the transition to clean energy technology. And the chart on the screen at the moment is one that may be familiar. It comes from the International Energy Agency, and there are multiple reports like this which show how much more mineral intensive the energy transition is going to be. And so at ICMM, we've been trying to square that circle over the last couple of years. How do we both increase the supply of minerals and metals, whilst also making sure that we're building a circular economy? And so we've been working with our 24 members that we currently have, who represent around 1/3 of the global mining industry by value. And you can see those members up on the screen at the moment. So our membership includes a lot of the biggest players in the mining and metal space. And we've been working with that group and with other key stakeholders, including key players in the minerals value chain, and with policymakers and investors, academics, and circular economy think tanks, to try and develop a framing for the circular economy which is going to get us to net zero, supplying the materials that we need in a way which is responsible, and making sure that we're not creating a wave of metals waste which is going to hit us somewhere down the line. And so we've landed on the framing that you can see on the screen at the moment. And so at ICMM, we talk about the circular economy as being 2 interconnected circles. On the first side, we have process circularity. And process circularity is about supplying all of the primary minerals that we know we need in order to meet demand, but doing so in the most circular way possible. So this includes eliminating waste as far as possible at the mine site. so valorizing different waste streams such as tailings or slag, reducing waste in the first place where we can use precision mining, making sure that we're reusing the materials that we have as much as possible, making sure that we're closing mines really effectively and leaving the land behind in a better state than it was when mining started, and crucially, decarbonizing the mining process. And this is an area that ICMM has been working on for many, many years. But we know that this alone isn't enough. We also need to make sure that the metals we're producing are staying in use and aren't becoming waste. There's no point in producing nature positive net zero copper if in a year's time it's going to be in a waste tip somewhere in the world and that value is lost. And so on the second side of our framework, we have what we refer to as product circularity. And this is about making sure that we're recognizing the materials that we are producing, these metals, as durable materials, different from consumable materials that once they're used, that's it, they're gone. We know that metals, if they're treated in the right way, have the potential to be used over and over again. And they're kind of the perfect material for the circular economy. And so on this product circularity side, we're looking at how mining companies can become involved in the processing of secondary materials, in keeping them in use and making sure that that value is retained. And we know that only if we do these two things are we going to be able to meet the huge demands of the energy transition. Recycling and recovery of secondary materials alone isn't going to be enough. We simply don't have enough out of the ground yet. At the same time, we need to be opening more mines and faster, and we know that it takes time to do that properly. We also know that we've put a lot of effort into mining in the past, and that material is still there, it's still durable, it's often lower carbon to use it again. And so we need to make sure that we're treating these stocks of materials as durable and we're keeping them in use for as long as possible. I can see a question in the chat that I'll just quickly address, which is examples of circular economy think tanks. So we've been working, we've spoken at various points with the likes of the Ellen MacArthur Foundation. We're currently doing a big piece of work with Circle Economy, who produce the Circularity Gap Report each year. So I'm talking about those sorts of organizations that are doing a lot of their thought leadership in the circular economy space. So to bring it to life a bit, because it all sounds very theoretical at the moment, what does this actually look like? So a number of our members have nature positive commitments. And in fact, just last month in Davos, ICMM launched a membership-wide commitments related to nature, which will take the industry further than we've ever been before in committing to acting responsibly around nature. We also have examples from our membership of really effective waste valorization. So Vale, for example, are using different technologies to turn something that would become waste from their iron ore mining into sand. So it reduces the amount of primary sand mining that's needed. It means that they're having to manage less waste and it's creating value for the company. So it's a win-win. There's also loads of examples from across our membership of regional circularity. So Boliden, for example, is one of our members who largely operate in Scandinavia, and they're using excess heat and energy from their smelting processes to support local businesses in a kind of regional industrial park. So just some of the examples of what circularity means in the mining process. On the product circularity side, there are a lot of mining companies which are already involved in the processing of secondary materials. And there's just a few examples up here on the screen. But a number of our members are either directly operating e-waste processing facilities, or they take secondary material and put it back through their own smelters, or they're making investment in those e-waste companies. So I wanted to share with you, given that this is an IPICA webinar, some work that we've been doing recently looking specifically at renewable value chains. So last year, jointly with the Enel Foundation, we supported a piece of work by the Columbia Center on Sustainable Investment. And this piece of work is available online at the website you can see down here, or just Google CCSI circularity mining, something like that, and it should come up. And this piece of work was to understand the current state of circularity across two key value chains And the key bit was looking at what conditions we would need in place to increase that level of circularity. So the work looked at wind turbines and solar panels, and within that, it looked specifically at steel, aluminium, copper, and silicon. And the researchers at Columbia looked at the key conditions that would be needed to make these value chains more circular through the whole way through the value chain. So they looked at the huge amount of mining waste that is created in these metals. They looked at the design and the production of these wind turbines and solar panels, and they looked at the end of life recycling. And the conditions that they focused on were policies and regulation, technology, business models, and finance. It's a hugely rich piece of research, which if it's of interest, I'd really encourage you to download. There's both an executive summary, which is in a PDF sort of Word style document, and there's a really extensive PowerPoint presentation, which has hugely important insights throughout it. So I'm just going to focus on a few key things because we've got some amazing speakers today, and I don't want to take up more than my allotted time. So the policy analysis focused largely on 9 key countries and regions, so including the European Union. And you'll find in the document key policy recommendations for the different jurisdictions on what we can do to increase the circularity within these value chains. There's also some key slides in there which are focused on recommendations for leaders within both the mining companies, but also within the manufacturers and power utilities companies. And so some of the key insights that I'll pull out today, the team really highlighted the huge value that's available within the tailings that we're producing in the mining industry. So in the past, it may not have been financially viable, or we may not have had the technology to fully extract the value from that waste rock that the mining industry has created. However, there is huge value in that. And we're seeing a lot of cases where mining companies are now going back to historical tailings and they're reprocessing them and they're managing to extract additional value from that. And to give you an idea, they look specifically at copper and estimated around $297 trillion worth of value within tailings. They also took ICMM's framework of product and process circularity and found that across both of those two areas, there are deficits at the moment in terms of technology and in terms of policy. There are a lot of cases around the world where we know how we could valorize different waste streams in the mining industry, but the policy framework isn't supportive of that. And so ICMM is now doing a lot of engagement to look at how we can make sure that the right policies are in place to enable this circularity. When it comes to technology, there are certain design features of solar panels or wind turbines, which either makes them easier or harder to recycle. And so there's an assessment of all of the different available technologies within those and what would be needed to increase the circularity of those value chains. And then on here, there's just a bit more information about the different areas that are needed to improve. I'm not going to try and cover this entire research in the next 2 minutes because there is so much detail in there. But if there are any specific points where anyone has any questions, then I'm very happy to do that. And I'll also share the link again to the research in case anybody wants to take a look at that. So thank you very much for having me. I'll keep an eye on the questions. Very happy to take questions at the end, but I will hand back to Christy. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Bryony. It is very inspirational to see how ICMM has explored circularity and what it means for the mining and metals industry, and also how big the potential is to have the improvements in both products and process circularity. And up next, we will have Rachel from IUCN and also Libby from FNF to talk to us about the responsible sourcing within renewable energy sector. So over to you, Rachel and Libby. Rachel, you might be on mute. While we are waiting for Rachel to sort out the technical issue, perhaps we can ask the first question to Bryony. Bryony, if you're here.
Yep, I'm here.
Great. So our first question, what role do you see of commodity traders here, and what kind of decarbonization targets that they can set, taken that they do not manufacture themselves?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and I think the pressure for increased circularity is coming from a whole range of different areas, and I think the commodity traders. I'm not going to pretend to be an expert in the world of commodity traders, but I think we are seeing a pressure coming from kind of all different parties into this, and so we're seeing increased policy pressure. We're seeing targets for recycled content, for example. We're seeing pressure from the rest of the value chain, and I know that there are some representatives from some companies on the call who we've spoken to who are wanting to see decarbonisation of the mining supply chain. So I think it's a combination of all different levers that are going to lead to increased circularity within the metals space. As to the commodity traders, I think they're probably part of that kind of bigger picture.
Perfect. Thank you, Bryony. And over to Libby to start the presentation, if you don't mind.
Yeah, great, thank you. So I hope you can all hear me. Poor old Rachel is having difficulties with her technology. So we're going to share the presentation, but I'll do my best to cover it all. I think what we want to talk about is very complementary to the work that Bryony's been describing. So I know yesterday we had a seminar that focused on responsible sourcing. So for those of you that were there, we'll be repeating a bit of that, I think, but thinking about the importance of thinking about the responsible sourcing of materials and the circular economy, taking a circular approach at the same time, both in terms of the sourcing of the materials that you will need for renewable energy production through to the sort of circularity and responsible mining end of it. So what we want to talk to you about today is some work that IUCN have been leading. I hope I've moved my slide on, is that right? Yes. So IUCN have been leading, and we have been one of the implementing partners. It's renewable energy project that's been going on for a number of years, and I know a number of IPICA members have been part of it too, and I've had the privilege of working alongside you. There've been a couple of phases to it. So in addition to IUCN and ourselves, we've been working with Biodiversity Consultancy, BirdLife International, WCS, and other members, including IUCN government members. And you can see there are current corporate partners, including Eni, EDF, Equinor, Shell, and Total Energies. So the work has had various elements to it. We're well into the first two phases and are now really focused on the third bullet that you see there. So we've done a lot around how we best promote the integration of cumulative impact assessments in renewable energy developments, which is, well, that alongside spatial planning are incredibly important to try and best prepare for as best we can, given the speed and scale of the transition that we're seeking to achieve. We'll all know the risks of sort of just focusing on getting to net zero and not perhaps giving due consideration and preparation to thinking about how we do that, where we locate the developments to make sure that we're thinking about wider spatial considerations within that. And we've just started now on the third phase, which is looking at the responsible sourcing of raw materials. This is specifically for solar and wind power, and that's what I want to talk a bit more about. And I think you'll all be very familiar with this, but the context to all of this work, and indeed our focus on renewable sourcing, is the incredible scale and speed of growth in the solar and wind energy and other sectors, both what we've seen so far and what we know needs to come, not least over the next 5 years, and the knock-on effect that this is going to have for the demand for key metals and materials. The work that Fauna and Flora have been leading very recently has been trying to take a bit of a bird's eye view of all of the regulatory and voluntary initiatives that have been established, both to support responsible mining and also more broadly around the responsible sourcing of minerals and metals to support the development of renewables, including everything from sort of early due diligence to due diligence as it looks now, looking at the drivers of that and what it covers, traceability standards, certification schemes, best practice guidance, and work both within those voluntary initiatives and within legislation on no-go restrictions and where can we simply not touch. And what we're very mindful of with a lot of these initiatives is there's lots of great stuff within it. There are many initiatives, possibly too many. That's sort of another issue. But a lot of them have been driven from human rights, social sort of corruption, etc., social issues, and biodiversity, nature, which is what we've been focused on, is often incorporated. Sometimes needs to be better incorporated, and sometimes isn't there. So that's been a very important part of it for us. And obviously, with the increasing demand for materials for renewables, thinking about where they're located and where we need to make sure that we're making firm decisions about no-go, whether to mine or not. Another hugely important part of this, which of course is the focus of the webinar today, is before we even get on to thinking about the responsible sourcing of materials, making sure that we're doing all we can to work in parallel to increase the circularity of material use. So looking for opportunities, as Bryony has talked through, to design for longevity and to look for opportunities to recycle, reuse and reduce material use where possible. We're all familiar with. This is a map that just talks through some of the key priority geographies, I guess, for, broadly speaking, we're trying to map out the materials needed here for wind and solar, but it includes other materials as well, and it misses some of the key materials needed for wind and solar. So we've got a broad idea of where a lot of the materials that we're going to be reliant on are going to be sourced from, and you can see sort of big bubbles around particular countries like Brazil and China, Indonesia, South Africa, Vietnam, Australia. So big concentrations of some of the materials that we'll need coming from particular countries. But one of the things that we're very mindful of is a lot of this information is still pretty high level, and we really need a concerted effort now to get a better grip on this and understand exactly where these materials will be coming from and overlay that with the biodiversity risks that are likely to be associated with that, so that we can most effectively plan for it. And that's going to be a hard task and a concerted effort needed to do that. Because if you look at this and you have a knowledge of biodiversity, you'll see big bubbles around areas that we know are also have very important biodiversity features within them. Sorry, next slide. So again, sort of with this biodiversity lens to the supply chain, I think one of the hugely important, we've historically thought about biodiversity in the context of mining and wider developments, renewable energy developments, as well as the sort of risks associated with the impact of the development for you as developers. But increasingly, you sort of need to twist that focus and think about the biodiversity as a supply chain risk. And some of you will have seen the most recent 2024 report from the World Economic Forum come out, which puts biodiversity nature risk third in its global risk indicator list, which is hugely significant. And a lot of the risks from biodiversity they're not necessarily being immediately felt, so it's higher up in the longer term risks, not quite as sort of in your face and now and impacting on operations of some of the flooding and drought and other associated effects of climate change. But it's very much there from an impact on nature, be that sort of the water that's used in the mining process through to the rubber that's used for the tires in the trucks on mine sites, etc. There are also other associated risks that are really, I would say, more than bubbling up. They're becoming very real within the supply chain, and for you as customers of material sort of need to be very well aware of with eyes wide open to. So things like regulatory processes and failure to taking effective steps to mitigate impacts of biodiversity at mine sites can complicate regulatory processes and make it very difficult for mines to obtain permits to operate. something that's very much at the heart of the work that we do at Fauna and Flora. So risks involving local communities and Indigenous people, and making sure that any sort of mining operations and planning have their considerations at the heart, and that they're consulted in the right way from early stages. Other thing, the social license to operate, which is very much linked to local communities. And then many of you, I know, will be familiar with emerging frameworks like TNFD and SBTN, and know from that the increasing focus that the investment community have on risks associated with biodiversity in your supply chains. So sort of thinking about, so there are many reasons why we need to think about circularity and responsible sourcing. And what we're trying to say really with this slide is that it's becoming a real risk. So it goes beyond being the right thing to do. It's a very essential part of your business plan. I talked briefly about TNFD, SBTN. Over the last year and a half, it's been fascinating and brilliant. Somebody sitting within a conservation organisation to see the speed at which initiatives have developed around nature and biodiversity, and really bringing that in mainstream into decision making around investments, and indeed for companies in thinking about their risks, dependencies, impacts on nature. These are very, very significant from a responsible sourcing perspective, and when we're thinking about wider sort of moving towards circularity within the sector, because what's particularly striking about some of the new voluntary disclosure reporting initiatives and indeed the legislation coming in the EU in particular, is that they go beyond operations, and they require you to better understand risks, impacts, dependencies associated with nature and biodiversity in your supply chains. So the other thing that's actually very positive about, I mean, that's all positive. Another very positive thing at a practical level is that a consequence of this will mean that there's a lot more consistency in the data that companies upstream in your supply chain are collecting. So it will be easier to get more robust data about what's happening. So sort of finishing off with some of the things that we are seeing and really sort of focused on moving forward. So I think to underpin this, we've had a webinar focused on responsible sourcing and today on circularity, but for us, the two really need to go hand in hand. Yes, avoid using first, avoid having to mine finite resources where we can, keep what we have in circulation, but it's not let's do one and then the other. The two must go hand in hand. And you will well know, I'm sure, as energy providers, those developing new solar, wind power, etc., that your responsibility as an end user is increasing, but there's also increasing support around you in terms of these initiatives to support you on that journey and make sure that you're sort of doing the right thing and doing the best that you can. The second, as I've just mentioned, is that biodiversity information is becoming much more accessible within value chains. And I'm not going to sort of be overly optimistic and pretend that we're there yet. There's an awful lot more to do. There's a lot more to do to go beyond sort of the social considerations and better incorporate biodiversity into, be it due diligence standards or, TNFD, etc., voluntary initiatives. But it is coming and coming very fast. So we're now at a stage with our work with this renewable energy working group, sort of thinking what next around responsible sourcing. I mentioned when we were looking at the map of where we're sourcing from and what the impact of that will be, is that there's an urgent need to really better understand that now, and not to sort of do it as an afterthought. We know we're roughly sourcing from here, so let's make sure it's done in the right way. That we need to make some real concerted effort together as a whole sector to make sure that we properly understand the biodiversity and social risks associated with this rapid increase in need for materials and development, and make sure that we're able to plan as effectively as we can for that. We'll be working as well, if Rachel were here, she'd be talking about the work that IUCN are very much wanting to do with this group and with others who want to be involved, to make sure that we take a lot of the knowledge and guidance we've been developing together to support member states and indigenous groups and other stakeholders to properly understand not just where the risks are, but where the opportunities are to try and do things in the right way and promote the right outcomes. We, as part of this working group, are very keen to collaborate to support the sector to move towards greater circularity and responsible sourcing, so taking the two hand in hand, and also to build on what Bryony was talking about with the movement towards nature positive and the importance of circularity within the mining operations themselves. So a snapshot of what we are up to, and we welcome others that want to get involved with us at this stage. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much, Libby. Rachel, I see that you're back. Do you have anything that you would like to add?
No, I think thanks so much, Libby, and apologies for the gremlins in my computer. I wish I could say I was somewhere exotic where I had bad Wi-Fi, but I'm stuck in Switzerland, so I'm not quite sure what's happening. But I think Libby's more or less covered everything, and I'll be happy to answer any questions to provide further details on the work that we're doing. Thanks, Christy.
Thank you, Rachel. And thank you, Libby, for reminding us how important policy, collaboration, disclosure, they all are important enablers of circularity and also the sustainable sourcing of raw materials in the renewable energies and the energy transition. And up next, we will have Maria from Shell, who will talk to us about circularity and renewables in Shell. And over to you, Maria.
Good morning, afternoon, evening, everyone. Yes, so maybe I'll just quick going so we can have some time for questions after that. So I'm representing Shell here, and I work in renewables business. So we do wind and solar, hydrogen, but I will focus on wind and solar as renewable sources in this presentation. This is our obligatory cautionary note. No intention to read it. Forward-looking statements in my presentation, and don't make investment decisions based on the information I'm sharing with you. Talking about circularity within Shell, this is really part of our overall Powering Progress strategy. So respecting nature is one of the pillars of our strategy, and circular economy with waste is one of the key focus areas. We're really looking at how do we look ahead, but also set short-term targets for ourselves. And we really recognize that we need to have a holistic approach, something that the speakers alluded to as well. It is not only about circularity, decarbonization, it's also about biodiversity, water, air quality. And there are a lot of internal requirements that we are working on and practices. And all we do is also in collaboration, because you cannot achieve any of that if you're not working together with your supply chain. We can only be as circular as our supply chain is circular, both at the input side of what we are procuring, but also once we decommission a project, what happens, the recycling supply chain also needs to be there for us. And that's why we have a lot of engagements with our supply chains to understand how do we move together towards a more circular future. And there are a lot of external partnerships, because to move to circularity, you need a lot of R&D, pilots, demonstrators, and scale-ups for that to be enabled. I think everybody here is aware of the statistics for we only 7-9% circular over the last few years as an economy, and we need to move away from it. We need to at least get to double digits in the near future, and that can only be done if we change the way we do things. I think also that was shared before. The external reporting, it is important. There needs to be a unified way of how can we compare suppliers, of how can we see which companies we can collaborate with to really move that topic forward, and that really supports us and the whole industry to move forward with those initiatives. If you're talking about really on if you focus in on wind and solar, which is the topic of this webinar, there are a lot of different ways you can slice and dice this information. I really like this graph. It's very much used also in the Netherlands in the circularity strategy, because I find it very action-oriented. So you look at the actions that an industry can take across the different R's. So first of all, the highest level is refuse and rethink. And also part of that is lifetime extension. One of the things we can say for materials components that are used in wind and solar parks, they're built to last. They're built to maintain extreme adverse weather conditions. They're built to last decades. Some components can have up to 60 years of a lifetime. And there is a lot of work going on right now in industry around plant maintenance, smart maintenance, smart materials used. There is a lot of going on to make sure we use an asset for as long as possible. And this is also the part of the business case, of course. So there's a lot of complementarity of what the industry already does and what, if you are a developer to build a renewable project, there is no conflict there. You want your materials to be durable. And this is something which I think is quite often overlooked. Does not help us on the other side because those materials don't go back to the economy for a really long time, but they're used for a long time as well. So you can have a look at it on both sides. And also there is a very customer use of refurbished components. If you look at what we use, for example, in the nacelles, into wind farms, in solar parks as well, a lot of the OEM, original equipment manufacturers, they're very well aware that we need to reuse and refurbish. Many of them have take-back schemes. So it is something that the industry, I can say, is working is very focused on. So that is really going on those lower on those R's, but it's still something which is extremely important in a circular economy. There is a very developed second-hand market. There is a secondary life for onshore equipment, for solar panels. There is a lot of, and it is a developed market. It's not. There are some challenges, of course, on regulations. You also have to think about how do you still have a responsible second-hand market, so you're not shipping your problem away, but you're really just securing to extend the life of the equipment that still can be used. And the other options, for example, and that's something that should be last, is recycling. And in that respect as well, the industry, there is a lot of effort now going up the waste hierarchy for recycling, and I'm going to talk about it more in depth in the next slides. But with all that, we need a regulatory framework to encourage circular solutions. So such as recycled content, which is currently not the case. It's the case in automobile industry, for example, and we see a lot of development there and eagerness to pay. And I think that was one of the questions about secondary versus primary materials. There is a cost differential, of course, currently in the economy, and there should be some form of incentive for companies to choose to go for increased recycled content, which is currently not there for most markets. And then, of course, you have to look into responsible recycling at the end of life. And there is a lot of overlapping waste regulation, which sometimes prevents it from happening. So a lot more to be done on the regulatory framework to enable all of those initiatives that are taking place. Then if you're really just to clarify what we mean about circular economy, we are talking about the circular solutions to extract the highest value and close material loops. But we still believe in the mass balancing approach, which means that you have open, so a blade does not have to become a blade at the end of life, but if it becomes some other high-hand application that is already participating in the circular economy. And we are talking about that there are multiple loops, because if you're looking at solar or wind parks, there are a lot of materials used of that, and what something that alludes to a lot of minerals that can be reused further if they're properly decommissioned. There is a mechanical pretreatment of them that makes them easier for a recycling company to process and separate out. The metals can directly go back to original equipment manufacturers of various industry. It doesn't have to be in the renewables industry. And then there are a lot of developments in chemical recycling as well, to really break down, for example, polymers and monomers, and that's how you create feedstock for chemical parks to diversify from fossil fuels currently used, fossil-based currently used. So it is really a lot of things need to happen, and a lot of collaboration needs to happen to enable that. And again, we can be only as circular as that circular economy and partnerships and collaborations exist. And then if you zoom in on wind parks, because it's been a lot in the media, majority of what a wind park is steel. There is copper, metal, other types of metals, cast iron, but it is majority of an offshore wind park is not dissimilar from any other offshore installation. You have metals and electrical equipment, and of course a lot of safety features and things like that. So just don't look at the numbers. It's a very averaged out representation of things, but it gives you a little bit of an idea of what materials do we actually use. And of course, it depends on the country. Sometimes we as developer can take control only until land. So yeah, it's just different. But yeah, you can see majority is essentially steel. And then there is a bit of a myth around that wind blades cannot be recycled. They can be recycled. The question is, again, more around how do we do it and how do we do it better. There is a lot of, I really like using this pyramid, and that's in the American Clean Power White Paper that we contributed to, and really breaks down a little bit of what can be done with a wind blade. And of course, as previously mentioned, the highest level is really to design for circularity, that the composite materials are made in a way, in such a way that they can be separated afterwards for recycling, but they're built to last, and that's why we use composite materials. Without composite materials, you will not be able to expand wind energy as we have today. So there's a lot of R&D happening, but it is very low TRLs, and so. But it is the industry is very aware they need to do something about it. There is, of course, something I mentioned already. Life extension is really inherent to the business case and to circularity as well. And there is a lot of resale repurposing available, which covers part of the end-of-life needs. It won't be enough for the volumes that are coming up in the future, but you do have some repurposing for wind barriers, skis, other types of equipment. And there is also an industry commitment to recycling, which I think is very important. We are also members of the Wind Europe, and there is a landfill ban that we are also participating in. So it is, as of this year, the companies are expected to start reporting on it as well. And there are ways to recycle. We can argue if this is the best way. If a wind blade, which can become a garden furniture, is the best way forward, but it is available outlet currently. It can go to cement co-processing. Again, part of it is burned, so in some regulations it's not allowed anymore. But it is. We've done it, for example, in the U.S. Just to avoid the landfill. That was the closest available option right now. And again, there are so many recycling repurposing pilots and scale-ups right now all over the world, which do have a lot of interesting developments, and hope some of them already building up real facilities now. So you can see how recycling is really moving up that waste pyramid. And in the interest of time, if you have more questions around that, I can talk a full 4 hours just on this topic, but I will move on. And talking about solar, right? In solar industry, you have an extreme track record, and we work with TNO on that one, of how good they were at material reduction. They're really good, and first of all, there are a lot of different types of solar panel technologies, and they use different materials, different proportions of it, but also it is very incredible how quickly they minimize the use of silver, for example. And there is a lot of long time use of that materials, and again, the developed second-hand market and the refurbishment is possible, especially for the electrical equipment. There are a lot of markets and companies that are working towards sustainable end-of-life management, right? I think it's an issue everybody is aware of, and the biggest debate here is how do we move from weight to value. because by weight glass is what you have most of, but the value is not in the glass. The value is really in the aluminum, in the profiles, and in the silver, which I said actually gets used less. So this is really what the industry needs to tackle. But there are, again, a lot of developments. Currently, the most of it is being processed. So, for example, in Europe, it is covered by the WE directive, which is treated as electronic waste, same as your fridge, for example. You have no choice. It is collected, which is the first step for recycling. What happens after, of course, is a very mixed story. Most of it, unfortunately, still goes to landfill. To mix with other materials after pre-processing. The glass can be separated. It does not happen everywhere in the world. So there's a lot of work to be done, but what gives me hope is that I see a lot of initiatives and the industry is really taking it seriously. And then just to sum up, renewables play a fundamental role in circular economy. If you want to move to a circular economy, it needs to be powered by renewable resources. So building up those wind and solar parks is what is going to enable all of those. For example, for steel to be circular, to maximize the use of scrap through electric arc furnaces, you need renewable power and hydrogen. So all of that is very interlinked and complementary. And that's probably the last thought I want to leave the audience with, and I think open to questions.
Great, thank you very much, Maria, for pointing out that circularity in the renewables is not just about one circle, it's not just one loop. In fact, it's many different opportunities, many different potential of closing smaller gaps in smaller circles. And yes, as said, it is now the discussion and Q&A time. So if you have any questions that you would like to ask our speakers and our panel, please do put it into our questions Q&A box on the left of your screen. So for the first question, we will start with Bryony. Currently, secondary materials are often more expensive than primary materials. What are some of the levers to address this cost challenge?
Thanks, Christy, and thanks to the other speakers. It's such an interesting webinar to be part of, and quite unusual to get the whole value chain together on one webinar talking about circularity. So that's brilliant. This question on secondary materials. So yeah, there is quite often a price differential between primary and secondary, and I mean the reasons for that are so complicated. But I think some of the things that are going to change that are, one of the ways we try to look at circular economy at ICMM is in terms of the different stocks of metal that we have available. So seeing at the moment we have a stock of metal that's underground, and we know that we can mine it, we know we can bring it to the surface, and we need to be doing that with the right ESG credentials in place. And then we have a stock of metal that's available above the ground, and that is in some of it's in waste, some of it's still in use in wind turbines and buildings and mobile phones and all these different things. And one of the issues we're seeing at the moment is a lot of that a lot of that historical stock above the ground hasn't been designed for recovery, so it's very cost intensive to get that back to a state where it's available for reuse. And so I think one of the levers that's going to help in this space is partly just growing the stock of available metal that's above the ground. So as we have wind turbines, solar panels that are reaching end of life, we're going to have more availability. But it's also about the design of those and making sure that they're being designed for recovery, so that when those products reach end of useful life, or when the technology is improved by a certain amount and actually it makes sense to switch out a part or whatever it is, we're able to get in and recover that. So I think there's certainly some kind of technology things, and part of it is just time and kind of growing that stock above the ground. But certainly our view is that we kind of need both. We need the primary mining to fill the gap, and we need the secondary. So yeah, we need the supportive policy landscape, we need the right technologies in place, but we also just need to grow the amount of recovery that's happening, and part of that is collection, but a lot of it is down to product design and making sure that things are being designed for recovery.
Great, thank you very much, Bryony. And the next question, I will first ask Libby and Rachel, and perhaps Bryony and Maria can add to that later as well, as it's applicable to everyone. So the question is, mining typically operates with very tight margins. Does the panel think that the additional requirements and expectations of some of the new standards and legislation is going to jeopardize the viability of some operations? And to what degree will these initiatives impact legacy mine operation impacts? For example, legacy tailings, mine water pollution, landscape impacts, etc.
Do we have, is Rachel here before I jump in? Rachel, why don't you have a go first?
Yes, and I'm happy to start, Libby. To be honest, I think that I'm not sure it's going to have such a significant impact on mining operations that are already following best practice, because I think a lot of what is being requested around the monitoring and the assessment, you'll find that a lot of the key players are already doing. I think that a lot of the requests that are coming from TNFD, SBTN are not going to be a surprise to the key players, but it's going to mean that some of the laggards are going to catch up, and this is not necessarily a bad thing, because I think what we look for in the conservation sector is that we do have best practice, but that best practice is followed by compliance, and so those that are implementing best practice know that compliance is going to be following them, and so they're doing something that they will be compelled to do in the future. So in that aspect, I don't think it's going to be too much of an issue for the bigger companies that are already following best practice. I think for the smaller, medium-sized companies, it can be more of a challenge, and this is where I think, especially when we look at the conservation aspects of it and the biodiversity aspects of it, having projects where you understand who is also working in your landscape and sharing some of those risks and those opportunities with other operators can also be beneficial. And then finally, when we look at issues around legacy and post mining, I think that what is happening now, to a large extent, actually probably needs to be improved. But again, I think it's very similar to the first response that I gave, in that if you're doing best practice, if you're following some of the guidance around, for instance, tailings that are coming out of that come out of ICMM, and some of the best practice around post mine and closure conditions, nothing that's coming will be a surprise to you. Libby, I don't know whether you want to add anything to that.
No, you've covered what I would have covered, Rachel. I think the piece on collaboration is really critical here. A lot of what we've been discussing in this webinar requires collaboration. That's not in direct response to the question, but I think particularly when we think about circularity and more widely, how do we mine responsibly in a landscape, as Rachel has said, like, it can feel huge if you're thinking about doing it all alone. So we must look at how we can work together. And I think your point about do it now while it's voluntary rather than legislated, there are so many advantages which may seem sort of slightly softer and harder to put on your balance sheet around doing the right thing and doing it early. We've talked about risk, talked about reputation, and those two, they're absolutely critical. So it's how you look at it in the whole as well. But I think the point is well made. When setting standards and thinking about how to move towards better practice, we need to make sure that it isn't just affordable for some and not for others.
Yeah. And sorry, I'm just going to add one thing, which I would have added to the presentation as well, is that we do also recognize that not all the responsibility can be laid at the feet of companies, be it mining companies or renewable energy companies. And so we are also working with our state members and our Indigenous members as well to look at their role in responsible sourcing, their role in promoting sustainability. And the aim is that, towards the end of this year, we'll be having some closed door meetings around that and coming out with recommendations for the IUCN Congress in 2025 around the role of state members and Indigenous communities as well in promoting both responsible sourcing and circularity as well. Thank you.
Thanks, Rachel. And Bryony or Maria, do you have anything to add to this question?
Yeah, I'll jump in on this one quickly. I think this is one of the areas where I think organizations like ICMM, which are trying to drive collective improvement across the industry, comes in. And so a lot of the commitments that our members have made so far go well beyond legislation, but we also know that there is a lot more sort of forward-thinking, difficult legislation coming towards the industry over the next few years. And so we're constantly trying to make sure that our members are up to date with that they're performing in line and in most cases well above what the requirements are. But we know that we only represent a third of the industry. And so a lot of what we do, anytime we produce guidance, we make sure that's publicly available. We have within our membership the national and mining associations for many of the key countries, in addition to the commodity associations. And so we touch indirectly far more than our 24 companies through that. The other thing is that we're currently involved in a process with 3 other of the kind of major standard setters in the mining space to try and drive towards a single consolidated standard for the mining industry, which would be available to far more than just our membership. And so this is kind of one of the areas where organizations like ICMM can hopefully make sure that companies are pushing well above the legislation and not just meeting the bare minimum.
Perfect. Good to hear, Bryony. And we have a final question for Maria. We're aware that we have more questions that we haven't answered, but we only have time for one last one. So a question for Maria. Maria, please, could you tell us more about the reporting requirements that will be needed later this year that you mentioned in relation to blade recycling?
Yeah, it's not the requirements, it's an industry initiative, right? So through Wind Europe, we have a commitment as an industry out there. And so now there is an initiative to also start reporting on it publicly. And also a lot of the industry included in the sustainability reports. So it is something that is just going to be streamlined over the next few years.
Great. Thank you very much, Maria. And we are just 1 minute to the hour. And so we have heard a few recurring themes today that circularity in mining and renewable energy is a complex issue. It involves the supply chain, biodiversity issues, climate issues. We need technology, policy, collaboration with indigenous communities, think tanks, organizations, and more. So I would like to take this opportunity to thank the speakers again for their insights and for their time, for their preparation today. And a reminder to everyone to register for the next webinar via the link on the resource box on the right of your screen. So thank you very much, everyone, for joining us today. And thank you very much again to our speakers for sharing all of your insights. Thank you very much.